Welcome to Climate Channel, Climate Conversation with Kamrul Chaudhary, Climate Action Pathways, episode 27. Today we are going to discuss on climate change and biodiversity measures. What we have achieved in 3 weeks marathon negotiation in climate change during our virtual subsidiary bodies meetings just ended, and also what has happened in United Nations Biodiversity Convention subsidiary body meeting on framing the framework for post-2020 biodiversity framework, and how far we have made progress in this subsidiary bodies under CBD, and how far we have advanced in terms of climate change negotiation, in terms of hitting the hardness, whether we could plug the low-hanging fruits. What has been our achievement so far in terms of climate change and in terms of biodiversity, in terms of synthesis between synergies between biodiversity and climate change, because these two United Nations Rio Conventions are interlinked, interdependent. So we have the pleasure of having Jamie Oiby in our climate channel to discuss it today. So I would now, without much ado, like to ask Jamie to kick off the conversation. What is your take?
Thanks, Kamrul. It's been very interesting watching the negotiations over the past month happening in parallel, the climate change negotiations and the biodiversity negotiations. They have a lot of similarities. They're both looking to come up with white papers or informal contributions to the next COP, because they're both held remotely. They're both having issues with connectivity and inclusivity that have hampered to some extent the validity or the robustness of the outcomes. And they both have fallen short of expectations on how far negotiations were hoped to progress. So we're seeing a lot of similarities between the two convention processes so far this year, and not necessarily in a positive way. The main issue under the Biodiversity Convention is the post-2020 biodiversity framework, where there's still some very significant divisions between parties in terms of how to even structure those targets, whether to replicate the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were a set of global targets, very similar to the SDGs, really, in terms of their ambitions and the sub-targets within them, or whether to follow a model more similar to the model followed by the Climate Change Convention, where there's global targets that are set, and then each country sets their own commitments and ambitions through NDCs and NAPs. And we still don't have agreement on that. And having been part of the process to negotiate the Aichi biodiversity targets, I know how difficult it was to arrive at a set of very concrete, solid targets that the world was able to work towards, and that would set the standards for assessing progress and implementation of the convention. And we've seen the same in the Climate Convention. But the Climate Convention has, through taking an approach that's much more country-driven, that requires much more what I would call intercessional work, has really seen much more progress in terms of countries understanding what their targets mean to their own economy, their own development pathways, compared to the Biodiversity Convention. So, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from how the Climate Convention approached Paris that I hope the negotiators of the Biodiversity Convention will pay attention to when they meet for the COP in October. Saying that, I'm very well aware of the fact that we are 5 years on from Paris now. And while it's taken almost that full 5 years to get to the level of having enhanced ambition NDCs and a good set of NAPs, we're still falling behind on implementation. And when we look at the pace of change that's required to achieve the Paris Agreement, it seems unlikely that we're going to get there. But, I'll just pass it back to you, Kamrul, because you've been part of the negotiations for such a long time. And actually, if you don't mind me asking you a question that I can share perhaps with my biodiversity colleagues about why the decision was taken under the Climate Convention to say, no, we will set one set of global targets and then countries need to evaluate their own internal economies, their own internal systems to identify how they can best contribute to achieving this global target. I mean, why did that happen? Why was that pathway selected?
So you have asked me a question. Jamie, you know that the political economy of climate change has been shifting, has been changing, like climate is changing. When we are crafting the 3 Rio Conventions in 91, 92, we thought that the developed countries, Annex I countries, the industrialized countries, after the Industrial Revolution of 1776, they mainly polluted. They mainly emit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and they are responsible for global warming. They are responsible cause of climatic changes. So that was attributed, and historical responsibilities were to them. But now it has been changing. Why? Because some of the developing countries, fast developing countries, are also emitting quite fast. If we calculate the current emission, then the number 1 emitter is China, which is a developing country. But falling behind United States, which was historically the most carbon emitting country, the largest emitter. So the narrative has also been changing. So these countries together, because the historical emitters and also new emerging emitters, they collided. They engaged in a mock fight and try to thwart the pressure of other countries, which are victims, innocent victims, because their emission level is very insignificant. And they are suffering from adverse impacts of climatic changes, droughts, cyclones, hurricanes, inundation, floodings. So that way, these countries are not powerful ones. These countries are smaller ones, but emitters are powerful, rich, richest of the richest. So they try to put all the pressure on the developing countries, least developed countries, small island developing states, and say that you should begin. We shouldn't take any quantified emission targets. It should be voluntary one. It should be LABLA. It should be bottom-up one. It shouldn't be a top-down one. So they try to push us onto a corner situation and try to win over in a imbalanced war. They won. They declared themselves victorious and put us on a corner situation and ask us to prepare our NDCs, go for our NDCs, and also they even don't know, say, why Article 6 or even MRV regime, even transparency, accountability, and also double counting, or say those things are not fixed out so far because of their pressure. They don't want anything. Say you have seen, say, 5 years gone by after Paris Agreement, landmark Paris Agreement agreed in 2015. Now we have crossed 2020. 5 years gone. Now we are in the middle of 2021. It is also advancing fast. But after these 5 years, 6 months, they are not coming up with any rigid, tough targets, ambition. Say IPCC is warning us, science is warning us, scientists are warning us, economists are warning us that every say centimeter or every say small rise is also harmful. It's dangerous for the planet. But who is hearing it? Nobody is hearing it. The global leaders are obsessed with other things. Their political commitments. In their political commitments, say even $100 billion is no higher. Net zero is no higher. And net zero they want not in their say 4-year or 5-year presidency circle or prime minister's tenure. They want to push it like they have pushed it to the least developed countries or developing countries corner. They would like to push it to their future successors. So in the future, nothing in their tenure. If they don't want to fix it in their tenure, they want a longer run period. You know, in the longer run economics, we say in the longer run, we all perish. Because we are not here. What will happen in 2050? Many of us will not be there at that point of time history. So we want to push all things to 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045, 2050. We can commit that. We can place that 100 times, umpteen times, but not here, not now. What we are going to deliver in 2021, are we going to mobilize $100 billion for 2020 and 100 billion plus for 2021? Have we mobilized that? No. But we are talking. We are not fixing that this year. In next 2 years or next 3 years, we are going to pick up our say emission. Then we will reduce it, cut back our emissions, and in next 5 years we are going to cut significantly, steeply. Are we going to commit that? We are not going to commit that. So we want to just delay things. We want to engage in negotiation. We want to say a lot of things, but no substantive and concrete actions onto the ground. Even whatever we commit, we are not going to enact in our own parliaments. Say $100 billion. Have we enacted it in US Parliament or British House of Commons or the House of Lords? That in next 3 years, 4 years, we are going to mobilize from UK Parliament. Will enact a bill providing, say, 20 billion pound sterling for developing countries, climate finance for next 2 years, 3 years. Or USA, say we are going to provide $20 billion in next 2 years, 3 years, because we couldn't provide support in 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20. So we will cover up that. That is not there clear. They are not nowhere to there. So that is the problem. And that problem is also in biodiversity convention. as you are negotiating biodiversity and framework. Right? It is not a huge agenda. It is a soft one. But for that soft negotiation, they are taking so much time. Why? Because they don't want any quantified targets, any specific targets. Because then they are in a box situation. They don't want a box. They want flexibility. They want liberty to cut back their forest. Say they want to. They don't want to manage the forest, and also they don't want to preserve or conserve the biodiversity, reach biodiversity. They want to exploit them at their rules. So what is?
I mean, it's a bit challenging, and it's actually a difference in a very important way. I mean, first of all, just to be clear, I'm not negotiating anymore. I'm outside of the negotiation systems now. But there's a few key differences between the Biodiversity and Climate Change Convention that are really important to point out. The first is the fact that under the Biodiversity Convention, a lot of the targets that are being set are actually either already enshrined in things like the EU Nature 2020 policy and EU regulations, or are very easy for developed countries to meet. So if you look at a country like Canada or Greenland, which is part of Denmark, setting aside 25% of the land as protected areas is really easy. Same thing with the US. These big developed countries, there's a lot of land that's not being exploited. It's very easy to meet the targets. In the EU, it's harder to meet the targets, but there's been policies in place for longer towards nature conservation, and there's a longer history, a political history of nature conservation in the continent. So it's a bit strange. There's that dichotomy there in the biodiversity versus the climate convention, where the so-called Annex I countries under the climate convention, or the developed countries under the biodiversity convention, the developed countries under the biodiversity convention are by and large already on a pathway towards achieving targets. It's the developing countries that are having a harder time because there are very few economic growth pathways that don't result in the degradation of biodiversity. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, about 2/3 of the population is reliant upon agriculture. Agricultural expansion is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. How do you develop an economic growth pathway for sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't involve the conversion of natural spaces? It's very, very difficult to do. Yeah. So that's one of the big differences, is that while under the Climate Change Convention, you look again at sub-Saharan Africa, which is responsible for about 3% of global emissions from electricity use, it's clear you can see a development pathway that doesn't involve high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, which is difficult to see for a country like China or India or Canada or the US. But so that's one of the key differences between the two conventions in terms of which group of countries has a development pathway that's more suited to achieving the targets. The second thing is actually, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here a little bit. One of the other things that was negotiated or during the subsidiary bodies for the Biodiversity Convention was support for technology and innovation. So the Biodiversity Convention has kind of a series of smaller initiatives set up to support the development of technologies and innovations that would support biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And those didn't go very far either. There was some differences as to whether the existing mechanisms are sufficient or whether new mechanisms are required. And of course, whenever there's new mechanisms, it means new funding. So a lot of countries pushed back and said, no, it's fine. We don't need more funding. We don't need more new mechanisms. And that is true in the biodiversity space overall. That most of the innovations, most of the technology development is coming out of academia, which is not very well funded and is quite often not linked to policy or to kind of industrial development. Whereas in the climate change space, absolutely, we haven't seen this 100 billion flow, but we're seeing billions of dollars being invested by countries in their own renewable energy sectors, in their own energy efficiency sectors. So we are seeing a massive flow of funding into that technology and innovation side. Again, it's selecting winners. You know, the developed countries are saying we're going to support our industries. We're going to support our companies in developing these technologies that are going to facilitate this pathway to green growth in our country and in other countries. But you shouldn't discount that, because the Biodiversity Convention would love to have that. The Biodiversity Convention would love to have Canada announcing a $2 billion domestic investment in biodiversity conservation technologies. That's never going to happen. So, you know, the scale of the problem is different if you're looking at developed versus developing. The funding that's flowing outside of the convention processes, the investments through the private sector, the investments through government and industry, they're just not even comparable. They don't exist in the biodiversity space. They absolutely exist in the climate space. And it's going to be interesting to see what role those industry support payments play in achieving the Paris ambitions, and to what extent the technology mechanisms under the Climate Convention are able to really capitalize on those and ensure that access is provided to those technologies for developing countries that are pursuing these green development pathways.
Thank you, Jamie, for your take. Yes, as you have pointed out rightly, that in biodiversity negotiation, developing countries are in a box situation also, because biodiversity can be conserved in developing countries. But then you need to also make some compromise with your growth trajectory. That is quite difficult for developing countries, these developed countries, and also African sub-Saharan countries, or say other countries, small island developing countries, because these countries are smaller countries and they have small land mass, and their main stay of livelihood is agriculture. So agrarian, these economies need a lot of that also hurt the biodiversity conservation. So that is not the problem for the developed countries in general, because whatever target they will get, they can achieve that. But for developing countries, it is very difficult. It is a Herculean task. But in climate change negotiation, developed countries are not doing, though they have the money and resources. They have dollars, pounds, they can do it. And they have also technology. Yeah. But they don't have political will. That is missing. So how best so we can marshal that political will? How can we marshal a Marshall Plan for biodiversity? A Marshall Plan for climate change. Stop the adverse impacts of climatic changes, and also say approach net zero, say in a quicker fashion. How best we can move forward our targets? Say not 2050. Can we make our target 2035, 2040, or 2030? Because in any way, as IPCC leaked report warned us that 1.5 degree we might reach by 2025. So what happened then? Yeah. See, it is our target for 2050, but we are going to catch that. We are going to be on the hook in 2025. So 25 years. Moving it forward, because we didn't cut back our emissions from 2010. we should have cut back our emissions from 2010, many countries, but we didn't. We had to cut back from 2015, we didn't. From 2020, we didn't. So now 1.5 degree is hitting, say, on our door, knocking our doors in 2025. So every CO2 unit matters. Every action matters.
All life on.
So we need to act fast. We need to act robustly. We have to ramp up support. Trillions of dollars have to be pumped in. Instead of every year spending $5 trillion for fossil fuel subsidies, if we just cut back some amount from there and invest in renewable energy, invest in solar energy, invest in newer technologies, and also emission reduction trajectories. If we can invest our NDCs, we can raise the ambitions and also move, scale up, support, finance, innovations, and also technology transfer can be done. Then collectively, we can reach the global goal. We can at least keep alive 1.5 degree rise limit alive. But are we going to do that right earnestly, right here, right in Glasgow, or before Glasgow? We are not making that commitment, that pledge to the planet. That is the unfortunate part. Jamie.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly we still see, both in the negotiations and in what happens between the negotiations, we see some challenges. At the negotiations, the reality is that there are, as you point out, very few people that actually have the power and authority to set the direction for an entire country, whether it's on climate change or development or any other issue. So this is why the high-level sessions are so much more than just a platform for people to speak. Certainly 10 years ago, I remember the high-level sessions was just when all the dignitaries came and they all made their speeches and then they left. And over the years, it's become much more important during those high-level sessions. That's when you see the presidencies coming in and saying, no, we're stuck on this and you need to figure out a solution, and bringing together the people that actually have the authority to enact a vision that's beyond what may be laid out in budgets or in party positions or in parliamentary decisions. So that's a very, for me, I'm very pleased to see that that's happened in the Climate Convention, that those high-level sessions have actually been used by some of the presidencies to say, no, you're not leaving this room until you guys, the ones that can change the vision, get on board and figure out this problem. But I think there needs to, the UK needs to be really taking advantage of that and figuring out how they're going to leverage that opportunity to get over the humps on the difficult issues like Article 6, like on loss and damage, like on finance, and just say, this is our responsibility. It's our responsibility as high-level representatives who are realistically the only ones in this space that have much authority in terms of changing directions. Most of the negotiators, as come in with their positions laid out already. So, what are the negotiations? What are the negotiations? They're moving along that spectrum, but everybody comes with their package of papers saying on this, you can do this, and on that, you can do that. And that's already, that's been decided almost already for Glasgow. Most of those decisions are kind of just in the final wording stages, or how far are we going to push it now, even though we're 4 or 5 months out. So that's one thing I'll be watching with a very high level of interest, is what happens during that high segment and how far the presidency pushes those dignitaries, how uncomfortable they make them feel, and how they make them, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a free platform. If you want to stand up and talk about everything that's great that your country's been doing, like is typical in the high level segment, that's fine. But you also have to do the hard work behind the scenes to get the negotiations moving. The second thing is about the technologies, and the technology mechanism is mentioned under the Climate Convention. exists. It doesn't really exist to the same level at all under the under the Biodiversity Convention. But we still see, and I see it every day in my work, that the investments in technologies are going to those safe spaces. So those large economies where there's a high level of private equity already flowing, where investment banks feel comfortable. And a great example is, recently I've been talking to colleagues about seaweed. And seaweed has absolutely massive mitigation potential. And I was talking to the World Bank, the IFC, WWF, some private sector actors, and I said, where are you investing? And they said, oh, we're investing off the coast of the UK. We're investing in the Faroe Islands. So, we might look at investing in Chile. It's a bit high risk, but we do that. And I said, well, what about in developing countries? Oh, no. It's the infrastructure isn't there. It's too far. We don't really have the data. We don't have the research facilities. We don't have the economies need to be set up. The markets need to be set up. It's too complicated. And that was very frustrating for me, because I thought, well, it might be complicated, but it still has to be done. And when it comes to technology, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to intellectual property, it is always going to be complicated. It's always easier to work where it's always easier to work where the technology was developed. But this is a global challenge. And so we can't pick and choose. We can't say seaweed has fantastic potential to mitigate climate change, but we're only going to take advantage of that potential where it's easy. That period is gone. That was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we could focus on the low-hanging fruit. We could do things where they were easy to do. Now we need to start focusing on doing things globally, where it's easy, where it's hard, where it's complicated, where we know, where we don't know. We need to be learning as we go. We need to be evolving as we go, but we cannot say it's too complicated. That time is done.
Thank you very, very much. It was great to have you. It was a pleasure talking to you in this conversation, climate conversation, and let us hope for the best. Let us see what will happen in October in UNCBD COP15, and also in October 31st, the beginning of say COP26 on UNFCCC Climate Convention in Glasgow. So Kunming and Glasgow, all eyes are for there, but hope for the best. Hope to see that the planet is protected, people and planet embrace each other and protect each other, thrive on each other. But we need to make a lot of compromises, a lot of, say, harsh decisions to protect our planet. So with that, I would like to end this episode. Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thank you, Kamral. Take care.
Thank you.